In MMA, finding the perfect fight matchup is a tough gig. Most of the times they nail it, but every now and then a matchup will have you scratching your head, especially our number one spot. It will definitely make you want to drug test the matchmakers. Yeah, it's that bad. So stay tuned and find out. And without further ado, these are the top 10 worst UFC matchmaking mistakes ever. Number 10. Conor McGregor vs. Donald Cerrone. UFC 246's main event was a bit of a head-scratcher. I mean, after watching McGregor face tough losses against Khabib and Mayweather, you would think UFC would line up a fierce competitor for him to make a comeback. But instead, they pitched him against Cowboy Cerrone. Now don't get me wrong, I have got mad respect for Cowboy, but at that point, he was coming off 2 knockout losses and nearing his 40s. It just felt like the UFC was setting him up for a fall. McGregor a confidence boost. Circumstances. Number 9. Petr Yan vs. Teruto Ishihara. There was a time when Teruto Ishihara was being touted as the next big thing at 145 pounds, but by 2018, the tides had turned for him. Dropping to bantamweight, I guess he hoped to turn things around and find that old spark. But sadly, even at the new weight, it was not his day, especially with that loss right off the bat. And then, of all the matchups, they put him in the cage with Petr Yan. That felt like a mismatch to me. Yan, coming off his reign as the ACB bantamweight champion, was already being whispered about as the next UFC champ material. The guys got Ara in the first round. Number 8. BJ Penn vs. Yair Rodriguez. In 2017, when Penn decided to give featherweight another shot, most of us were scratching our heads. I mean, he had been having a rough patch, and then they threw him in there with Yair? Let me remind you, Yair was on fire at that time. Dude was 10-1 and just came off a win against Alex Caceres. He was soaring high, full of confidence and energy. Meanwhile, Penn, at 38, and with a string of losses behind him, it was heartbreaking to see him in that position. The disparity between their recent performances was too obvious, and when they finally faced off, it was brutal. Watching Penn get dominated like that, especially given his incredible legacy, was a tough pill to swallow. The MMA community was up in arms about the matchup, and rightly so. And after that devastation in just over a round, a lot of us felt like maybe it was time for Penn to hang up those gloves for good. Number 7. Sean Gannon vs. Brandon Lee Hinkle. The whole Kimbo Slice era was something else, wasn't it? I mean, the guy had charisma and street cred that drew masses, but when the UFC tried to bank on the Kimbo phenomenon by bringing in Sean Gannon, the so-called Kimbo killer, that was, well, interesting. You might remember watching that viral video of Gannon and Kimbo going at it in some dimly lit room and thinking, is this guy really UFC material? But hey, views talk, right? Gannon had this mystique about him because he had taken down the street legend. Yet, when you broke it down, Gannon had only 2 pro MMA fights and not the kind of training you had expect for the big leagues. Then UFC 55 happened. Brandon Lee Hinkle, not exactly a household name, gave Gannon such a whooping that the guy ended up in the hospital. It was a stark reminder that while hype might sell tickets, it does not replace genuine training and experience in the octagon. While Dana White would childishly brag about this while discussing Elite XC, there is no way around the fact that the UFC still irresponsibly gave him a shot in the octagon without a real resume. Number 6. CM Punk vs. Mickey Gall. You can understand the appeal from a business standpoint. A huge WWE star making a crossover to the UFC would obviously draw a lot of eyeballs. But from a pure sports perspective, it never made any sense. CM Punk had no professional MMA background. You have got to admire his guts for wanting to step into the octagon, but there is a difference between bravery and readiness. 2 years of training, even with the best coaches, does not make up for a lifetime of grappling or striking practice that most UFC fighters have under their belts. Mickey Gall, on the other hand, was no joke. A promising young talent with a serious jiu-jitsu background. Throwing Punk in against him felt less like a legitimate matchup and more like a promotional spectacle. It went exactly as most predicted. Gall took advantage of Punk's lack of experience, especially on the ground, and made quick work of the former pro wrestler. Hey, but before we continue, go ahead and smash that like button like Mickey Gall smashed CM Punk's pretty face. Also, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you would not miss any of our videos. Number 5. Sage Northcutt vs. Cosmo Alexandra. Sage, with his chiseled physique and boy-next-door charisma, was a marketable figure in the UFC. He was still very young in his MMA journey, and while he had promise, he was still very raw in many aspects of the game. After his release from the UFC, the move to one championship seemed like a fresh start for Northcutt, but the matchmaking raised eyebrows. Facing Cosmo Alexandra, a seasoned striker with vast experience in kickboxing and Muay Thai, was a scary task for anyone, let alone a young up-and-comer like Sage. The matchup was super short, and unfortunately, the outcome was brutal. Northcutt's face suffered 8 fractures and went on to have a 9-hour surgery to repair the damage. This is a perfect example of the crucial importance of matchmaking. Number 4, Jose Canseco versus Hongman Choi. Jose Canseco has had quite a name for himself in baseball, and the idea of him stepping into the MMA ring was fun. But come on! Putting him up against Hongman Choi? That was just wild. Choi was a beast, and Canseco, for all his claims of being a black belt, looked way out of his depth. The whole pacing around the ring, and then that slip, made the whole match look out of place. In the end, Choi jumped on with ground and pound, and Canseco tapped to end the weird matchup. Number 3, George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz. Yes, George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz was a mismatch. Both fighters are great for different reasons, but when it came down to styles and strengths, it was evident how this bout was going to play out. GSP's wrestling is top tier. The man's ability to control where the fight takes place is second to none. And with Diaz, as talented and tough as he is, his takedown defense just wasn't up to the task, especially a masterclass from the Canadian. Pedro Rizzo versus Dan Severn. Pedro Rizzo, no doubt, was a legit heavyweight and a scary striker. When he was set to face Randleman, there was genuine excitement, even if he came up short. But then to have him headline the very next event against Severn? Talk about a mismatch. Dan Severn was a legend, don't get me wrong, but by the time of that Rizzo fight, he was way past his prime and had been more active in the pro wrestling circuit than the MMA world. It was not like he was staying active against top competition, and the speed and evolution of the sport were just a bit too much. The sound of Rizzo's leg kicks on Severn, some fans say they can still hear it. Every thud was a reminder of the mismatch, and it was painful to watch such an old-school legend like Severn go out that way. No wonder Peretti wanted to distance himself from the matchmaking decision. The entire situation showed the dire state the UFC was in and how far behind they were compared to Pride in terms of quality matchups back then. Number 1, John Jones versus Chael Sonnen. The whole Jones versus Sonnen saga felt more like a reality TV setup than a legitimate title fight. Don't get me wrong, I respect Sonnen for what he has brought to the MMA world, especially with his ability to hype up fights. And for sure, he brought some much-needed life to TUF 17, but that's where it should have ended. The fight was mismatched from the get-go. Sonnen had been away from the division and was not bringing a track record that screamed title contention. Jones, on the other hand, was in his prime, and there's no sugarcoating how dominant he was. To put Sonnen, especially after a loss in the cage with Jones, it felt more like a business move than a competitive matchup, and that's the catch, is not it? Sometimes in this sport, entertainment value and numbers come before true competition. Sonnen's mouth undoubtedly secured the fight, but as fans, we knew what was coming. Jones made quick work of him with a broken toe. And while it might have been good for ratings and ticket sales, for those of us who love the integrity of the sport, it felt like a hollow event. Which one of these mismatches had you scratching your head? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. But that's all for today. See you next time. Till then, remember to protect yourself at all times.